World Oregon and grad students from the Global Leadership and Management program of the Public Administration School at the Hatfield School of Government here. And they are really sharp students, and they really are learning how to navigate diverse opinions in the town square. So if there are things you don't get to in terms of the questions and answers today that you want to dig in on, we are doing our diving into the decisions discussion next Wednesday at noon. So there's that. Other things on the horizon. I think I talked about this last week. We are looking for dinner hosts. We are beginning to get people coming back. I was just talking with David Margulies down here about coming back into in-person programming and what that looks like. And I applaud all of you for coming on this journey with us as we do it. If you need to stay home sometimes, it's streaming. You can do that. The first two programs are on YouTube. If you want to watch them, it is World Oregon's YouTube channel. And this one will be up about a week from now. So anyway, coming back into the town square, part of that is hosting. We are bringing a lot of international visitors back into our community. And one of the best ways that we can be diplomats and ambassadors for Oregon is to open up our homes and share a meal with them. We have folks coming from Armenia, Australia, Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Mauritius, Nigeria, Philippines, Poland, Switzerland, Togo, and Vietnam. So this is February 11th or 12th. You can go to our website and look at how to become a host. Also, Crystal Wessel is here today. We could probably talk to you about it. But really phenomenal way to make connections, and it can be lifelong. You may have friends in corners of the globe you never thought you might have just by making a tater tot hot dish for them. I just betrayed my Midwestern roots. Anyway, very excited today to have a speaker, Jeffrey Meiser, who is someone we have not worked with before, and I love when we get a new face, a new voice. He's from the University of Portland, who has been a wonderful partner for World Oregon over the last couple of years, and hopefully more so going forward. Jeff is an assistant professor in the political science department at the University of Portland. He previously worked for the U.S. Department of Defense as an associate professor and director of the South and Central Asia program at the College of International Security Affairs at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. He's also taught at the University of California, Santa Barbara, Johns Hopkins, and the University of Mannheim. His book, Power and Restraint, The Rise of the United States, was published in 2015. There will be a test on this, so you might want to find it. And he recently published articles in Special Operations Journal and Parameters, the U.S. Army War College Quarterly. It is a little reminder, other things you can look into. Apple. You can go visit Iceland with our own intrepid and fearless leader, Derek Olson, next summer. There is a direct PDX to Reykjavik flight. I don't know if you knew that. Great way to get out of Dodge for a minute and see some geysers. Eat some pickled shark fin and things like that. Anyway, I want to remind you that Great Decisions is brought to you by Portland State University and World Oregon, and is made possible with the generous support of Kathy Moyd, who is a longtime member of World Oregon. And let's all give Kathy Moyd a big thank you. So I will get out of the way, but it's always a good reminder that world affairs are your affairs. This is a copy of the initial materials from 1953 that probably were sitting in a room not very far away from us, right here, inviting all of you to become global citizens and learn a little bit more about how Oregon connects to the world. More on that down the road. Big hand for Jeffrey Meiser.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thanks for having me. I'll note a couple of things starting out is that I have been promoted. I'm now an associate professor. So and the thing I really need to have in my bio is that I'm the father of 3 boys. 2 of them are twin 3-year-olds. So for me, getting out the door in the morning, getting my kids to school is like the biggest achievement of the day, like every day. So once I get that done, I'm like, okay, I'm good. Everything else is easy after that. Thanks for having me, and I'm excited to talk about energy geopolitics. It's a huge topic. It covers so many areas of the world, basically every area of the world, and everybody is involved and interested in and impacted by energy geopolitics. So how many of you did the assigned reading? Anybody? Okay. So my talk will have different from that. I thought that was very good reading and it had a lot of good details, but I want to talk a little bit more about the sort of the theoretical underpinnings of geopolitics a bit, where it comes from, and then how we can apply geopolitics from that perspective to energy, right? So that's where I'm going to kind of have my little intervention here in the topic. So first off, when I say geopolitics, what do you think? Shout it out, anything. Geopolitics, and you think? World, good. Anything else?
Cold War.
Cold War, good.
Right.
Ukraine, good. Right, yeah, good. So oftentimes when we think about geopolitics, we think about power politics, interactions among countries, right? There's like the basic things, like what's going on in the news somewhere else, that's geopolitics, right? That is, I don't want to say wrong, but a bit misguided. But I understand why we think that way. Now, pretty much everybody thinks that way about geopolitics, and we get it from Henry Kissinger, right? He is notorious for being terrible about this, among other things, I guess you'd say. But anything to do with international politics, he calls it geopolitics. Russia doing this, oh, that's geopolitics. Something's going on in the world, oh, geopolitics. I'm going to try and do my Kissinger here. Geopolitics. So that's not really all we have. It's, geopolitics means something special, right? Or else why say it? You just say international relations or world politics, right? So for me, here's my definition of geopolitics. Geopolitics is the study of the interaction between geography and politics. That's kind of obvious, I guess, right? It's the study of how the biophysical world shapes the pursuit and use of power by human societies. So to me, politics, how I define politics, domestic politics, international politics, is the competition for power. That's what's going on in politics. So the geo part means like, how does geography, how does the biophysical world affect politics? That's what I think is important. So geopolitics always involves space, involves the natural environment. It's things like continents and oceans and rivers and mountains. It's about what kind of climate you have in a certain area and how that affects how politics play out. And it's super important. It's really super important. There's mention you're going to hear about China in a couple of weeks, right? So if you talk about China without understanding that China is far away, you sound like an idiot, right? It's like a lot of discourse about China suggests, oh, well, they're just 2 countries kind of floating in space. No, China is far away. Taiwan is far away from us and very close to China. Those basic facts are important. In fact, crucial for understanding the dynamics of our interaction with China, and especially the issue of Taiwan. Taiwan is very close to China, very far from the US. That in itself is a problem. That's geopolitics, right? So I think geopolitics applied to energy is pretty natural. It's a pretty natural thing to do. Energy is so inextricably linked to the physical environment, the biophysical environment, right? You have deposits of energy resources in the ground in specific places in the world. Right? That's the starting point for understanding energy geopolitics, is that you have resources, they're unevenly distributed around the world. That's going to be crucial for understanding anything to do with energy is that basic fact. Before I get like too far into the energy piece there, I do want to note that the geopolitics has kind of a troubled history. Anybody know what I'm talking about?
Wars.
Wars, yeah. It's definitely associated with wars. Associated with like territory, like obviously, right? It has kind of an issue with, like, if you go back farther, it's associated with things we generally view as negative, like imperialism, colonialism, and racism, ethnocentrism. So if you look back to the geopolitics of 100, 200 years ago, even back to Aristotle, like even way back, there's geopolitics, geopolitical thinking going on. And just take an example of Aristotle and people like him, they'd start with being like, okay, well, we all know the Greeks are the best, right? We all know the Greeks are the best, so why is that? Oh, well, we have like a temperate Mediterranean climate. That probably makes us the best. People in the north, they don't have time to think about things. They're just like hunting for like stone axes and stuff. They don't really, they're ignorant, they're primitive, they can't do it. People in the south, it's too hot. They're just baking in the sun. They're not very smart. Greeks are the people who are really smart, right? Then moving forward, everybody thought that about themselves. So you go like French geopolitics, you know, this is why France is the best. The British, this is why the British are the best. Or Germans, this is why Germans are the best. Our environment created this thing, right? So that's, you know, ethnocentric. And then, you know, fast forward a little bit, you get to like the Nazis, right? The Nazis definitely weren't in geopolitics. Anybody heard the term Lebensraum? Right? This is the Nazi geopolitical justification for their expansion. They need living space, right? That is a geopolitical concept, right? So it's important to think about that in terms of like where we move forward is that unfortunately, when you talk about geography and maybe controlling different areas of geography or projecting power, those issues come up. Colonialism, imperialism, even like with the Nazi genocide, right? And these are not positive aspects of geopolitics. But I think we still can use that framework without that bad stuff and do it more objectively and have a better understanding of the world through this framework. So the basic ideas of geopolitics generally are, there are some places in the world that are really important to either control, protect, or have access to. The places that if you're going to be a successful great power, you need to be able to access these types of places. Okay? There's also another important strain of thinking in geopolitical theory is that there are some places in the world that are very dangerous. So there's like really positive, good places you need to have access to. Other ones you need to kind of contain or be afraid of, more or less, right? So two like pretty recent geopolitical thinkers, I'll just bring up as examples. Jakob Riegel, his book, Great Powers and Geopolitical Change from 2006. He's an example of a geopolitical thinker that's trying to make an argument about what areas of the world are important. And he makes the argument that he has all these great case studies going back hundreds of years, even thousands of years, I think like the Ming Empire, something like that. Whereby if you want to be a really successful, great power, you have to do these things. You have to project power to these certain types of areas. So what he says are resource centers, trade routes, the two most important things. If you don't have access to the key centers of resources in the world and the key trade routes, you are going to fall as a great power. You're not going to last long if you can't have access to these places. The third thing says you have to have secure borders. Okay? But in terms of what we're thinking about, I think the idea of being successful in world politics and geopolitics, you have to maintain access to resource centers, the more important resource centers, and to trade routes, right? You kind of see where this is going with energy is that this is obviously really closely linked, right? Secondly, the second book is called The Pentagon's New Map. It's by Thomas Barnett. The book is from 2005, but he wrote a pretty well-known famous article in 2003 with the same title in Esquire magazine. And he was a professor at the Naval War College. He became the talk of the town in Washington. Everybody was obsessed with what he was thinking about. He was giving presentations all over to all the most important people, making tons of money too. Good on him. But his idea was more about where the threats come from. He had this theory about divided the world between the integrated core and the non-integrated gap. These are the two big regions of the world. So either you were a globalized developed country, you're part of the core, or you were not globalized, you're disconnected, you're a part of the gap. Right? So his theory, and stick with me for a minute, it might not sound that great, but very, very influential. So in the gap, this is where the threats came from. He said the places that were not developed, not integrated, not globalized, this is the basis of the threat. Right? He's speaking from the US perspective. Right? And so, guess in 2003, guess kind of where he's thinking about it. What's on his mind? So,
Middle East.
Middle East, because of something happened in 2001.
Just a reminder, we can't really do that because it doesn't work with a Zoom audience. Can't do the give and take with the audience. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that was my main shtick, but that's fine. We'll finish that for later. Okay, so just to, I'll how about this? I'll ask the question, I'll answer my own question.
Yeah.
So what was he thinking about 9/11 attacks, right? Everybody's trying to interpret and understand the rise of terrorism, right? What's going on? Where it's coming from? Why? What is this threat? So he's saying, well, threats in the modern world as of 2005 are from this non-integrated gap. So if countries develop and they globalize, then they're not going to be threatening anyone. And that's what we need to do. But first, he says, US needs to provide security in the gap. This needs to project power to these unglobalized countries. 2003, guess what he's thinking about? Iraq. He supports the Iraq War, right? So I don't think this has aged that well necessarily. And I think especially now, he even said specifically in his work that peer competitors or other developed countries are not dangerous. It's these undeveloped countries that are really dangerous, right? So fast forward to today, it's like the opposite of what we're thinking now, right? It's the rise of China is the big threat. That's what we're really thinking about. So I think he's not really gotten it right, but I think that's an example of a way of thinking of trying to categorize the world as where it's threatening and where it's not, with Griegel's ideas being more about, well, here's the source of influence, wealth, and strength, and that's where we need to focus ourselves. I think the crucial element about geopolitics, the usefulness of it comes from the fact that it helps us focus, helps us prioritize what we need to do as a country. How should we prioritize our diplomatic and military and economic power in terms of gaining influence? Where do we need influence? Where do we need to focus our attention? Where are the important parts of the world? Because you can't do everything everywhere, right? I think a good example of this, someone mentioned the Cold War. Anybody ever heard of George Kennan? I'll tell it to the Zoom audience, everybody raise their hand, everybody knows. So George Kennan is kind of the founder of the US grand strategy for the Cold War. The idea of containment. Contain the Soviet Union, that's what we need to do. His original formulation of this is containment means you have to prevent the main centers of industrial power from being controlled by the Soviet Union. So you have to contain the Soviet Union. If you contain the Soviet Union, it will fall of its own weight. It will collapse internally, right? So you just have to stop it from expanding, and it will disappear as a threat eventually, right? It took a while. His formulation was, so the main centers of industrial power he's talking about are Western Europe and Japan. You protect those and you contain the Soviet Union. That's all you have to do. Okay? That's a very geopolitical idea. Two centers of power you have to protect from a hostile power. That's a very geopolitical concept. But I don't know if you've heard of Harry Truman. He became president a little bit after this. And he became known for something called the Truman Doctrine. It's not something he necessarily invented, but came about under his watch. And it was the idea the US should protect free peoples everywhere. Very different, right? Are we going to protect Western Europe and Japan? Or are we going to protect everywhere that's not the Soviet Union, right? Again, yada, 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 we have Vietnam. And it seems unwise to try to protect everyone everywhere all the time. Then we have Nixon come back with a little bit of retrenchment. The Nixon doctrine is like, well, we'll support you if you support yourself, essentially, right? So we have these ups and downs, but that is geopolitics. That is a geopolitical debate. What areas of the world are important and what aren't, right? For geopolitical debate. Let's think a bit about, applying this to energy. I think it's pretty obvious part of this application, and maybe part of it is not quite as obvious. So again, if you did the reading, you maybe noticed the statistic that 75% of the world's energy still comes from fossil fuels. 75%, that's a lot, right? Where do you find fossil fuels? As I suggested before, they're in the ground somewhere, right? Some places have them. They're in specific places, some people don't. You have to take them from where they are to the people who need them. Almost every country in the world needs to import some kind of fossil fuel resource, right? So this is the basic fact of energy geopolitics. Some places have a lot, they need to get it to places that don't have it, right? So extracting it and transporting it. Transporting it, of course, is trade routes. So how do you move fossil fuels around? What are they called? Super mega tanker, ships. That's one thing, but also pipelines. So you have transit countries like Ukraine. Someone mentioned that earlier. Ukraine's a transit country. Pipelines run from Russia, Western Europe through Ukraine. There's an extensive pipeline network, right, through all of sort of Eurasia. So from Kazakhstan and places like that, go through Russian territory, the European Union, also go to China. Extensive network of transit states. So they're important for geopolitics, like who controls the pipelines, very important. Who controls access to the resources, of course, very important, right? These are key issues for geopolitics. And I think that just thinking in this way helps us understand various aspects of the news today, lots of things that are going on, right? Does control of resources or the control of access to resources, does it empower countries? Hell yeah, right? Definitely. Does Russia have a lot of influence because it has a lot of energy resources? Yeah, of course. And you know what Russia did in 2008? Invaded part of the country of Georgia, right? 2014, invades and takes part of Ukraine, Crimea, and also invades the eastern part of Ukraine, Donbass, right? What was the penalty for Russia? Some sanctions here and there, right? But nothing that really seemed to shape their behavior, right? Why was that? They're an energy superpower, essentially, right? They're one of the biggest producers of both gas and oil of anybody, right? So their influence and especially their integration in Western Europe, right? The amount of energy that they were sending to Germany and to Western Europe and Eastern Europe too, gave them a ton of influence, right? So they got power from having those resources and controlling those. I think that's definitely the case. And then, I don't know if you were tracking the news lately, but even a few months ago, there was all this talk of crisis. That Germany was going to leave the Western alliance. They were so dependent upon Russian energy, they just weren't going to be able to stand with the US. They were going to give in, essentially, right? And go and do whatever Russia wants, right? So the basic understanding there was that Germany is so dependent, they're going to hold along with Russia. They're going to be part of the Russian bloc, right? And I think Germany did a pretty amazing job of then gaining other sources of natural gas they needed, liquefied natural gas. Also, it's been a mild winter in Europe, so they haven't had a big crisis there. But yeah, so we all know from the way we talk about these things, energy resources are really quite important for all sorts of stuff. I think if we switch to China just for a minute, is that we have, what's the basis for conflict with China in East Asia? A big part of it is what's in the military we call SLOCs. SLOCS, sea lines of communication, right? This just means major maritime trade routes. Where do they flow? Like China gets something like 85% of its energy, or I think it's petroleum from the Middle East, from the Gulf, right? That flow, that trade route goes right along through the Indian Ocean, up through the east part of the East Asian coast, that coastline, through the South China Sea. Places like that, right? So these are very important, like flashpoints for geopolitics, right? So again, it's about energy in all ways. What about the renewable energy revolution, the clean energy revolution, our clean energy revolution? Are we still going to have geopolitics? It's the end of energy geopolitics, right? I would agree. Most of you said no. No, it's not the end, but there's probably a slight alleviation, perhaps, on the horizon, meaning like in the decades to come, right? So one way in that we move forward to talk about renewable energy geopolitics, one thing that's still there is we still need stuff out of the ground to do renewable energy, right? Like cobalt, copper, lithium, right? We need these things to make batteries, to make solar cells, all the things that really are important for renewable energy and using it. Like you need stuff out of the ground, right? So countries, there's still going to be an issue of those, usually called rare earth elements or something along those lines, right? Those things are in specific places, right? And as we move more and more toward renewable energy and something that's called net zero, you've heard of that, meaning that basically emitting no carbon as a net factor, right? If we move towards that, right, we're going to do less burning of coal, oil, even natural gas, right? So we're still going to need resources that we're going to pull out of it, right? So that's still going to matter. Also, certain locations are better than others for renewable energy, right? Sunny places, places with rivers. Yeah, what else? You have geothermal power. You talked about Iceland earlier. Hey, lots of geothermal power possibilities in Iceland, right? Wave power, tidal power, all these things. It really depends on location, what kind of power you're going to have access to, right? So this means that the geopolitics is still important. What else? I think that we also have other types of fuels that you may or may not have heard of. Believe it or not, you can burn hydrogen. Right? Hydrogen can be a fuel for cars, for power plants, whatever you might want to power. You can generate electricity that way. So and you can use for transportation purposes. So being able to produce that is important. What do you need to produce that? There's blue hydrogen and green hydrogen, believe it or not. I'll get this right. So blue hydrogen you create from natural gas, from methane. Any chemists here in the Zoom audience will know this. Methane is CH4, that's the chemical formula. That's a lot of H, right? Right, so you can break apart the H's, you can get the hydrogen out of methane, right? But guess what? You also have carbon that comes off of that. You have carbon dioxide that comes off through that process, right? So that's not great. But you can also create hydrogen, green hydrogen through electricity. So use electricity, apply it to water, and then you can get very clean hydrogen, green hydrogen, right? So who can do that? If you have access to clean energy like hydropower, something like that, and you have access to a lot of water, you can become a green hydrogen superpower, right? In theory, right? So you still need fuels, you still need minerals, and so the geopolitics are going to still be there. Right? It's going to be geographically differentiated. Okay? Also, as we suggested before, resource centers are not just minerals and fossil fuels and so on. It's also the centers of manufacturing that are important. So which countries or which areas are going to take the lead in developing the technology we need for the renewable energy sort of revolution, ongoing revolution, right? Who's going to be the best at creating solar cells or batteries, the best batteries, transmission lines like for electricity and so on, even nuclear energy. You can see like kind of a renewal of nuclear energy too. And I guess the final point I'll say is that the one way I think that geopolitics will kind of decline in importance a little bit is that if you think about these things you have to transport, probably they're not as bulky, as heavy. You don't need to do as much transport necessarily to do with gas and oil. So I think there's something there that'll be different. Also, electricity is local. You don't generate electricity in Oregon and ship it to China. You don't do that, right? You don't even generate electricity in Oregon and ship it to New York. You don't do it, right? So electricity as the basis for our economy moving forward more and more is going to be much more localized. In a lot of ways can be a good thing. That people in that area, they control their own power. They're not bringing in resources from a long ways away. So I think that's where geopolitics will maybe slightly be ameliorated to some extent. All right, so I'll end it right there and go ahead and do some questions.
I've got in mind, I get the first question. So in thinking about where we have sort of increasing or growing economic, strategic, and energy sort of unknowns, I think about the Arctic. And I'm wondering, with increased access to Arctic resources and with states like Russia and China looking very, very much eyeballing those with interest, whether the U.S. is likely to develop a comprehensive Arctic strategy and what role you think the Arctic will play in the next 10 years of energy.
Yeah, I think it's quite likely the U.S. will like develop strategic documents relative to the Arctic. How much they'll actually do, I think, sort of depends on how much they're forced to do, given what Russia or China is. So, but I mean, there's a lot of challenges when we talk about exploiting Arctic resources. So we have great areas of like Russia, for example, or Canada that are considered permafrost, that's melting, right? So what happens when you have built up energy infrastructure in roads on permafrost and it melts? Sinkholes, massive sinkhole, it destroys its infrastructure. This is a big problem for developing the resources in a melting Siberia or whatever you might have. You need to invest massively in infrastructure, which, given Russia's situation right now, can they do that? That would be a challenge, right? I think one other element of that that's interesting, again, going back to Griegel's kind of framework, is that you do also have trade routes that will become more available as there's more and more ice-free periods of the year for the Northwest Passage, and you can actually now take a ship from northern Europe and go around Siberia, right? Come around and you're in Japan, right? So these trade routes also could be a source of conflict, perhaps. So I think there's definitely possibilities of conflict there, but I'm not one who thinks it's going to be like super easy to be exploiting this resource. It's still a really challenging trade.
Thanks. And again, we're going to alternate questions between me with a mic of those in the room and Tim with questions he's getting over Zoom. So hold your hands up if you have a question, and we'll keep them brief. We'll just back and forth for the speaker. So raise your hand if you have a question. Okay, and Tim, if you have another one, why don't you go ahead and ask that one while I get the other side of this.
Great. So after Russia invaded Ukraine, all of a sudden we see Norway popping up as a significant source of energy in Europe, but Norway is also not in the EU. Could this present problems going forward? I mean, I think about the wonderful television series Occupied. Could we see something like that happen in the future? And where is this sort of pivot of energy in Northern Europe going?
Yeah, I remember watching the first season of Occupy and being like, oh, wow, this seems like very realistic. But I think it's less realistic today than it was when the first season came out. I think that Europe is more united than ever. And I think that Russia's power has been very significantly degraded since the first season of Occupy. We take that as a moment in time to support, right? I don't know. I think that the issue for Europe moving forward will be, so they thought, let's take Germany, for example. Germany thought it had plans to be net zero, very, very green, very renewable, but over like the long term, right? So the idea was that natural gas is a cleaner sort of bridge energy, so that in a few decades, you have several decades of cheap natural gas, and then you move forward, and then you can get more and more renewables, and then you'll be okay. Now they're having to really do this much faster. And so I think that what you'll see probably in Europe is a much more rapid transition to renewables. And so they're going to want, so for the moment, they bought so much. You might have seen these pictures online of all the liquid natural gas, where it usually goes, and then where it started to go after Germany was like buying it all up. It was like, oh, it's going everywhere, and there's like all of it's going to Germany, right? It's very interesting to see maps like that. So for the short run, they're doing stuff like that. They're relying on Norway. stuff like that. But I think that they really want to have a more stable energy situation. They're going to move forward very quickly with more renewable.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I wondered if you'd talk a little more about rare metals. Last week we read an article about Latin America, and there were references to the anti-extraction movement. And then we've recently been reading about Pope's visit to the Congo, where he said, stop these Westerners or others from ripping you off. And of course, we're reading about efforts to improve our resources or looking for resources in the United States. I just wondered if you have any ideas about the future of this whole challenge.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I think that if you kind of watch the news carefully, I've seen like in the last month, at least 3 articles about different places that are working to develop these rare earth elements. So they are in quite a lot of places around the world, but the extraction part can be easier or harder depending upon what kind of deposits there are and things like that. So yeah, Democratic Republic of Congo has huge reservoirs or deposits of cobalt, right? And the mining of cobalt, if you've seen pictures of it, it looks bad, right? Not that any mining looks really that great, right? But it doesn't look like a good environmentally friendly thing to do, right? So that's why I don't like to call renewable energy always like clean energy, because there's a lot of dirty stuff going on right behind the scenes. So it's supportive of reducing global warming, but not always clean. Like those are different things, right? So I do think that as we rely more and more on these elements, that more and more places will produce them. And so that's sort of how the market generally works, is that demand goes way up, then you can produce, then it becomes it makes more sense to then produce it in more places that weren't really feasible before, right? So I think that's what we'll see. You probably see new technologies for extraction, like the whole fracking revolution in the United States, where the US went from net importer to net exporter of fossil fuels, essentially, right? So you can see those things happening. Could also look forward to like the Jeff Bezos plan, which is to mine asteroids, things like that. So who knows? A few years, give it a few years, it could happen. So yeah, so there's a lot of possibilities there, but I do expect more attention to be paid to the negative effects of the mining of these minerals. That will become a bigger deal.
So our first great decisions talk was on global famine. And one of the issues that has come up often in talking about food insecurity and relative in many ways to what's happening in Ukraine is the question of fertilizer. So Russia is one of the leading producers of fertilizer, which is a byproduct of petroleum, if I'm not mistaken. Can you talk a little bit about the connections between the energy and food?
Yeah. That is getting just beyond my expertise. It's like a little technical for me. So I yes, it's related. I think I know that. Exactly how you produce fertilizer, like I can't really speak to that much. I do think that the fear over the impacts on the world food supply from the Ukrainian war were kind of a bit overblown, and they basically dissipated. Like the price of food, it went way down, right? So, so I don't think that that's the biggest challenge, but yes, there is an issue.
Well, and I know I don't like when people redirect, but I like to do that. In terms of a national security issue, though, I'm wondering where people in your profession who are looking at issues around defense and security, how do you look at the fulcrum between energy and food? And are they looked at in a holistic way, or are they looked at in silos?
I mean, I think food security is way down the list. Yeah, I mean, like in terms of like the Pentagon and so on, it's not really a thing, honestly. Yeah. I think that a lot of it, like there was a book written a while back by this economist named Sen, last name is Sen, and essentially arguing that you get famines because of politics, right? It's not like some element of the natural world you have famines. Usually it's because somebody in power is preventing food from going to places it needs to go, right? So, so that becomes like the main issue. Like in Ethiopia, there was the insurgent group, all humanitarian aid was being cut off to Tigray, right? So people were dying of hunger there, right? That's usually how it goes, right? Is that somebody in power is victimizing people by not letting them have food, right? As resource power. As a global like security issue, yeah, the US, to my knowledge, doesn't really think much about it.
You didn't really talk about nuclear energy at all, and yet nuclear energy is non-polluting. It's available on a smaller scale than it used to be. And do you see that as a potential solution for the future?
I am a pro-nuclear person. I think it should. I think it definitely should. I think there's still a lot of negative feelings about nuclear power. So I think, the investments required, I think politicians aren't really jumping on that very much. But I think it is. I think it would be a good solution. And I hope it does become part of the energy mix in the United States. But like you probably know, the trend is to shutting down reactors, right? Unfortunately.
In Europe.
What's that?
In Europe, they're using it.
Yeah, but even there, like Germany had a plan to shut down all its reactors. They decided to extend the lifetime of those reactors, but they still have a plan to eventually shut them down. Like, I think when was the Fukushima disaster was like maybe 2011, 12 or something like that. That had a big impact on people when they saw that nuclear plant melting down. And so nuclear does still have a kind of a negative connotation. But I wish that there would be more development in that direction. But I'm not super optimistic about that.
So a couple questions we've got here from folks online. Kathy Moy wonders, do you have an opinion on the geoeconomics of the use of renewable hydrogen, i.e. made with an electrolyzer and not methane?
The geoeconomics of that. I mean, I think as far as my knowledge goes, like hydrogen is very light element. So if you want to actually have produce a quantity of it and then ship it anywhere, you have to, if it's pure hydrogen, it has to be like negative 250 degrees or something like that, which is hard to do. Or you can turn it into ammonia and then you can ship it as ammonia. So there are ways you can do it. I mean, I think we're pretty far away from that, all the infrastructure developing, but I mean, I think the experts on this do think that's happening, and that people who are able to jump out and do that really well, like early, I think will have an advantage. I think that's true. But I mean, I remember it must have been like 20 years ago, maybe or more, where people started hyping kind of hydrogen cars. I don't know if anybody else remembers this, but there was an idea that you'd be able to pump hydrogen at the gas tanker, the gas station. You could have a hydrogen car. It went nowhere, right? So we need to have we would need to have a big change in how people view fuels and hydrogen in cars to be able to really ramp that up. It seems like. I guess probably it would be more useful maybe in like industrial processes, maybe more sooner. But I think we're still. I mean, we're looking at like decades and decades of the future, probably for anything really happening. It seems like.
So another question from Virginia Mead is, I understand that China has huge rare earth resources. How does that impact our relationship with China?
It's one of many factors, I would say. I think at this point it's not like front and center, except you do have people worrying about this definitely. So you do have efforts to develop them in friendlier countries. So the USA supports that. I think that some of you may have heard about this a couple of years ago where China got mad at Japan and they shut off all shipments of rare earth elements to Japan. It was kind of like a warning that, hey, we can do this. We have this power to coerce and influence you. But I mean, there's also a counterproductive nature of that, right? It's that all of a sudden you're Japan, you're like, well, China's not reliable. So then what do? Right? You invest, you look for other sources, you buy a mine in Democratic Republic of Congo, like you do stuff, like you don't just sit there, right? So the fact that China is a major producer and that also people are worried about it will then lead to more sources being developed. And I think that's what is.
So, the article argues a lot that climate mitigation is going to require shifting primary sources of energy. Now, China, just to go back to China, we've seen so much sort of comparing to the great powers discussions, but China is increasingly one of the world leaders in green energy production. So as we look at the competition versus cooperation ethos, should the US attempt to cooperate with China in green energy manufacturing, or should we be developing our own more competitive manufacturing capabilities independent?
I know. Yeah, that's. I guess the first thing I say is it depends. And my second would be both. I mean, I think that, so there is one way of thinking, yes, that China is the biggest threat in the world. The US has to do something about that. There's another way of thinking that, well, no, it's climate change and things like that that are the biggest threat in the world. We need something about that. If you believe the second thing, then you want to cooperate with China. It's crucial to cooperate with China. And therefore you want to lessen, limit, mitigate any types of conflicts. And you really want to be able to work with China really well, if you can, right? Of course, China has a vote in that. So you have to be aware of that. So China has been more or less aggressive at different points in the past, 10, 20 years. So I wouldn't be someone to say, hey, it's so crucial we cooperate with China that we have to ignore any aggressive, nefarious action by China. That I think would be a bad idea. But I also think the US has to look for as many areas of cooperation as it can with China. And I do think that cooperation is vital to like a peaceful, better, more just, and environmentally sustainable world. Like that is better. It's better, right? So if we can, we should do that. It does depend on China also wanting to cooperate. Sometimes I try to cooperate with my 3-year-olds and they don't want to, and that kind of makes it a problem. So not to compare China to a 3-year-old, but that's sounds dynamic like taking place. So you need to kind of have both, right? And I do think the US, I'm not comfortable with the fact that China basically produces all solar panels. I'm not really. So I do think diversification, having some of that in the US is important.
I have another hand for our speaker today. Great questions in the room and online. Again, for those of you zooming in, apologize for the Zoom hiccup at the start. Thanks for bearing with us. It's really important for us. And as Tim has mentioned, with the partners, PSU and sort of Kathy and others, to make it possible for people to come join us in person or join us online, whatever your comfort level is. And I know sometimes it depends on what your schedule is. So speaking of schedules, next week, there is no talk because it just was not possible to have a room. So we're taking a break next week. When we resume on the 17th, we'll be back for the rest of the series in the room we were in for the first couple of weeks, which is just down the hall. Again, thanks to PSU for their support and flexibility as we've moved around. It's great that they are having more events here on campus. It just makes it a little more complicated. So look for the YouTube channel where we have all of our past talks up, and our e-newsletter where we have all the upcoming events. Thanks again for coming. And for those of you online, thanks for zooming in, and we will see you all virtually or in person in 2 weeks. Thanks.